The first particle effect we're going to create for our lightning attack is the lightning hit particle effect. I'm going to go ahead and add a reference to this lightning hit particle effect to our scene so we can see what we're trying to build. I'm going to go to the VFX reference prefabs folder, locate the lightning hit prefab and drag it into the scene. Now we can see what it is we're trying to build. We can see that this particle effect has some smoke, some sparks, an inner light, and a zigzagging lightning pattern. So let's go ahead and start building it. I'm going to start by going to Create, and then Particle System. We're going to go ahead and start by creating the smoke. And right now, since I'm dealing with just one particle system, I'm going to go ahead and close the particle effect window so I can deal with it primarily in the inspector. The first thing I want to do is determine my duration. Now I know the lightning attack has a cooldown of 1 second, so no matter what, I really don't want my particle effects to be longer than 1 second. That way we get to see the entire effect every time we attack. I'm going to set the smoke to be 0.75 seconds. Now when the attack actually occurs, we don't want this to loop, but right now during testing I'm going to leave looping on so we can see all of our changes. We don't want the lifetime to be 5 seconds. We in fact want it to be rather random. So I'm going to change the start lifetime from constant to a random between constants. And the lifetime is going to be between 0.2 and 0.75. We can leave the start speed the same, and we can leave the start size the same. We do want to start rotation, however. We're not going to be able to see it just yet, but it will be very important for our smoke. The start rotation we want to be a random value so that all the smoke doesn't look exactly the same. So I'm going to choose a random between two constants. And those values are going to be -45 and 45. Like I said, we're not going to see any effect with this because we're dealing with perfectly round particles right now, but later when we apply the actual smoke texture to this, we're going to be able to see that rotation. We want our particle systems to simulate in world mode, so I'm going to change that now. And we want the scaling mode to be based on its shape. Eventually we are not going to play on awake, but for now we're going to leave that checked. Under emission, we actually don't want an emission rate, so I'm going to set this to 0. Instead, we want smoke to burst out when it first starts up. So I'm going to create a burst by clicking on that plus icon, and that burst is going to be 30-30. The shape for the smoke is not going to be a cone. Instead, it's going to be a sphere. We're going to leave all the other defaults the same. Now we can see that particles are emitting in every direction from the center of this. The next module we want is going to be the limit velocity over lifetime. So I'm going to go ahead and add it by clicking the plus icon in the upper right hand corner and saying limit velocity over lifetime. I'm going to leave this as its default values, but we can already see the effect that this is having on the particles. The next thing I'm going to do is change its color over lifetime. So I'm going to add that one as well. For this one, we're going to use a gradient. I'm going to click on the color picker, and in the gradient, I'm going to do two things. The first is that I'm going to start at a full alpha, a value of 255, but fade out to 0 alpha, completely clear. The second is that I'm going to change its initial color. That initial color is going to be 0, 192, 255. Next, we want the size of our particles to change over their lifetime, so I'm going to add the size over lifetime module. I'll click in this window, and I'll see the Particle System Curves editor appear in the inspector. If this window is too small for me, I can always right-click on it, which detaches it, and allows me to bring it in as a much bigger window. I want the size to range from 0 to 2, so I'm going to change the value in the upper left-hand corner to be 2. I'm then going to start it at 0.5, and have it grow to a value of just under 2 by around 25% of its lifetime. The easiest way to do this is to double-click on the timeline to create a keyframe. Then, all I need to do is simply drag the keyframe up to the value I want it to have. And I'll level it out. Now we can see the effects that this is having on the particles. They grow in size very quickly at the beginning, and then they just sort of level out. When I'm done with this curves window, I can simply hit the X and that'll put it back in the inspector. The last thing I want to do is modify the renderer. What I want to do is give this a custom material and texture. If I go over to the VFX folder and then the materials subfolder, I can see that there are actually quite a few particle effect materials already created. The one I'm interested in is shaded smoke. If I select that, we can see how this is set up. The shader for this is set up as particles/alpha blended, which means this is an alpha blended particle. And then the texture is this shaded smoke texture right here. Now to apply this shaded smoke material to my particle system, I'm just going to go to the renderer, and where it says default particle, I'm going to click the circle select to the right. Here I'm going to find shaded smoke. Now we can see the effect that smoke has in our scene. Adding a new material with a new texture causes a pretty dramatic change on our particle system. We can now even see how the random rotation really plays into effect. The last thing I'm going to do is change the name of this smoke to be VFX_zap smoke. The next particle system I want to create for this effect is going to be the sparks that fly off the enemy when they're hit. To create this, I'm going to go to the hierarchy window and select Create Particle System. Again, we're back to our default particle system, and this time we're going to turn it into some sparks. We'll go through the modules again and give this the settings we're going to need to have a really cool spark impact effect. Just like the smoke, we want to change the duration to 0.75. Again, we're not normally going to want looping, but for now while we're testing this, we're going to leave it on. We're going to change the start lifetime, and we're again going to do a random between two constants. This time, our start lifetime will be between 0.25 and 1. We want these sparks to fly off at a high velocity, so we're going to set their start speed to 10. We also want them to have a random size, and so I'm going to change their size from constant to random between two constants. The values for the start size are going to be between 0.5 and 0.3. We're also going to give this a start rotation, and again, this is going to be a random between two constants. This time, the random numbers will be between 180 and 0. Just like the smoke, we won't see those rotations until we add a different material and texture. We want our world gravity to apply to these, so let's go ahead and set up a gravity modifier. We could do a gravity modifier of, say, 1, which is 100% gravity being applied. But we want the gravity to really weigh on these, so we're going to change it to something a little bit more extreme. I'm going to change the gravity to 2.24. Now we can see how the particles are really pulled down by gravity very quickly. Again, we're going to change the simulation space to world and the scaling mode to shape. We also won't normally want play on awake, but we're going to leave this on for now. Just like the smoke, we're not going to want a constant emission rate. So instead, I'm going to set the emission to 0. What we really want is a burst, right when the lightning hits the enemy. So I'm going to hit the plus icon in the lower right hand corner, and we'll add a burst with a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 10. The shape of our emitter is going to remain a cone with an angle of 25, but we want a much smaller radius. So I'm going to set the radius to 0.04. Now we can see that the sparks are going to come from one central place. We're going to leave the emit from to base, but we do want to select random direction. The next thing we want to add is a color over lifetime module. So I'll add that by clicking the plus icon in the upper right hand corner and choosing color over lifetime. For the color of this, we actually wanted to seem to fade in and out, sort of like a twinkling look. So I'm going to click on the gradient for the color over lifetime, and I'm going to start adding some alpha values. It's going to start at full alpha, and it's going to end at 0 for alpha. However, to get that twinkling effect, right after our full alpha, I'm going to click above the gradient to create another key, and that is also going to be 0 alpha. Then right next to that, I'm going to create another key, which will be full alpha, and then another key that'll be 0 alpha. Then a little bit further, about halfway, I'll create another key, which will be about half alpha. And then just beyond that, one last key that's going to be full alpha again. The effect is going to be sort of a twinkling in and out look for the particles. Next, I'm going to change the starting color to be a slightly darker blue. Now we can see the particles sort of popping in and out. It's a subtle effect, but a lot of visual effects are very subtle. The next thing we want to add is we want to add a size over lifetime. We want these sparks to shrink in a linear fashion. So I'm going to go ahead and add the size over lifetime module by clicking the plus icon in the upper right hand corner and choosing size over lifetime. And for the size over lifetime, I want it to start with a value of 1 like it has now, but I'd like it to steadily decline all the way to 0. I could attempt to drag the last keyframe, however Unity is going to attempt to create a curve for me, which I could attempt to correct with these handles. Instead of doing that, I'm going to look at the presets at the bottom and notice that there's a preset for a downward straight line. I'll choose that, and then I will see that I get a nice downward straight line from 1 to 0. Finally, I'm going to go to the renderer and we're going to set up our custom renderer settings. For the material, we're going to want the Zap Beam additive. So I'm going to click the circle selector to the right of the material name, and I'm going to look for Zap Beam additive. Now I'd like these sparks to sort of appear on top of the other particles. They're very small and they move very fast, so we don't really want to lose them in the smoke. To do that, we're going to give this some sorting fudge, which basically means that we want it to attempt to be drawn on top. In order to give it a sorting fudge that will make it be drawn on top, we want to give it a low number. Lower numbers have priority. So let's go with a number like -20. At this point, our sparks are also done. We could let our sparks fly up in the air like this, or we could remove the rotation about the x-axis and have them fly backwards, which would allow it to emphasize an impact when the lightning hits the enemies. I'm going to go ahead and leave the rotation there so the sparks are flying upwards. However, I just wanted to show you that that was possible. One more thing I want to do before I forget is I want to rename this particle system to be VFX Zap Sparks. The last particle system I want to create for this particle effect is going to be the lightning hit parent, which is going to have that zigzagging pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and create one more particle system by going to Create and then Particle System in the hierarchy window. I'm going to rename this one Lightning Hit. Now for this particle system, I want the duration to only be 0.5. It's actually going to be shorter than the sparks and the cloud, but that's fine. We really want the lightning zigzag to appear very briefly and then a little bit of fog to linger afterwards. Again, I'm going to leave looping and play on awake on, though later we're going to turn it off. For the lifetime of this particle system, we're going to choose a random between two constants, and those values are going to be between 0.2 and 0.25. Our start speed is actually going to be 0. We don't want them going anywhere. And our start size is going to be very small at 0.16. We're going to give this a start rotation. However, I'm going to avoid doing that for right now because I really want to emphasize the effect that that's going to have. We'll come back and add it in just a moment. The start color of this particle system is going to be 28, 198, 203. Just like the others, we're going to change our simulation space to world and our scaling mode to shape. Now, unlike the other particle systems, we do actually want there to be a rate for this. Our rate is going to be 15. We're also going to add a burst, however, because we want an initial burst of extra bolts, and then the 15 that come after. So I'm going to add a burst and change its values to have a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 3. I don't want my particles spawning all over the place. I want them to actually spawn in one spot. So for this, I actually don't want a shape to my emitter, and I'll just remove it. Now we can see all the particles spawn in the same spot. Now I'm going to add a size over lifetime. And for this size over lifetime, I'm actually going to create a very dramatic effect. Instead, I want them to be between 0 and 8. I want the starting size value to be somewhere about 6.5. And then somewhere between 15 or 20% through its life, I want it to spike all the way up to 8. To add a new keyframe, again, I'm just going to double click on this line. I'm then going to move this up to 8. Finally, I want my particles to shrink pretty substantially as they get close to the end of their life. So I'm going to click the End keyframe and drag it all the way down to just above 0. The effect we can see now is a very intense flickering. Now I'm going to go down to the renderer and give it a custom material and texture. I'm going to click on the circle selector right next to the material name. And for this, I want to choose the lightning bolt material. Now don't worry that that looks pretty odd right now. This is actually a texture sheet animation, and we're going to get it to actually animate between these different particles. To add that texture sheet animation, I'm going to add the texture sheet animation module by going to the plus icon in the upper right hand corner of the inspector and choosing texture sheet animation. Now in the texture sheet animation module, I'm going to specify how many columns and how many rows there are. We can see that there's only one column and there are 8 rows. And so I'm going to put a 1 in for the value of x and then 8 for the value of y. The effect we have now is this zigzagging in place. However, as you'll recall, I had mentioned earlier not wanting to do the rotation just yet. Now I'm going to go ahead and add that rotation, and we're going to see just how much of an effect it's going to have on this particle system. I'm going to go back up to the main particle system module, and for its start rotation, I'm going to change it to be a random between 2 constants. The values for the start rotation are going to be -80 and 120. We can see now that that lightning bolt zigzaggy pattern is rotating all around in a circle, which really gives us the effect we want. At this point, our particle effect is almost done. It's worth noting that there's more to this particle effect than just the particle systems. We actually want a script on it. But before we do that, let's go ahead and construct this. So we know that the lightning hit game object is the parent game object of this effect. So I'm going to go ahead and click and drag Zap Sparks and Zap Smoke down onto lightning hit so that it's nested as children. Then I'm going to go ahead and place Zap Sparks and Zap Smoke at the same location. I'm going to do that by right-clicking on their transform component and selecting Reset. Now we can see this effect more complete. The last thing I'm going to do is I want to turn off that play on awake and that looping on each of these particle systems. Now we can see that if in the scene view we click stop and then simulate, we'll see the one-time visuals of this lightning hit effect. It's also worth noting that the lightning hit inside the VFX reference prefabs folder has one more particle system, which is called Core Glow. If we want to see that particle system, I can just click and drag it to unparent it. It'll warn me about breaking a prefab instance. I'm okay with that. And then I can just hit stop and then simulate. Now that I've seen it, I'm just going to hit Control Z to put it back. Now we're not going over that in this section. Instead, I'm leaving that up to you to implement on your own. Feel free to try to create it on your own from the reference, or simply look at the reference and copy its properties over to your particle system. Now that I have the lightning hit just about done, I need to apply one more script to it. This is the script that's going to make it work as part of our attack. That script is the AV player. I'm going to add that by going to Add Component, Scripts, and then AV Player. The AV Player is important because it allows me to play a particle effect and an audio effect one time without worrying about enabling or disabling this game object. That way I don't have to worry about any form of timing. I can simply encode, say, AV Player, play your effect, and it's going to go ahead and play the particle effect and any audio we might have later at the same time. Our lightning hit particle effect is now done, and so I'm going to go ahead and save it as a prefab in my prefabs folder. I'm going to go to the prefabs folder, and I'm going to create a new subfolder for my visual effects by right-clicking on the prefabs folder, going to Create, and then Folder. I'm going to name this VFX. Then inside this folder, I'm going to click and drag my lightning hit into the project window. Remember that this lightning hit is missing one particle system that's up to you to implement. In the future, that extra particle system will automatically be in this prefab for us. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and create the lightning attack particle system and then wrap it up by putting it all together and damaging our enemies.